I paid off my student loans years ago, but the bank just revealed the real payer. The man my wife swore was just a ghost from her past. On today's episode of The Wander's Tales, we dive where quiet courage prevails. Hidden truths and hearts so bold, stories of fear left untold. If this calls to you, don't delay, subscribe, tap the bell, and stay with us. The Harmattan haze hung heavy over the Lagos skyline, a dusty shroud that made the towering glass structures of Victoria Island look like ghost ships in a beige sea. Kofi sat in his home office, the hum of the air conditioner a low, expensive purr that usually soothed his anxieties. But tonight, the glow of his laptop screen felt like a spotlight on a crime scene. For the third time this quarter, a notification had landed in his inbox from a student loan trust, a digital ghost from a life he thought he had buried under years of architectural commissions and smart investments. The statement was, as always, an anomaly. It showed a massive lump sum payment that had cleared the remaining interest on a loan he hadn't touched in months. At the bottom of the PDF, in the small, sterile font used by the bank's automated system, were the words, "Payment received with gratitude. Thank you for your continued commitment, Mr. EO." Kofi's own middle name started with a K, and his surname with an A. He had spent 5 years telling himself it was a glitch in the mainframe, a fortunate error in a country where banking systems often stuttered under the weight of their own complexity. He wanted to believe he was lucky, but as he stared at the EO, a cold finger of intuition traced a line down his spine, suggesting that luck had nothing to do with the invisible hand reaching into his past to scrub away his debts. He remembered the lean years in Mushin, the smell of diesel and damp concrete, where a university degree felt like a golden ticket that he couldn't quite afford to cash. Back then, every naira was a battle, and the loan was a heavy yoke around his neck that threatened to pull him back into the gutters of his youth. Now, as a man who designed the very skylines that defined the city's ambition, he prided himself on his self-reliance, his bootstrap narrative that he shared at networking galas and charcoal grill brunches. To acknowledge that someone else might be holding the pen to his financial ledger was to admit that the foundation of his life was built on a lie. He looked out the window at the distant lights of the Lekki Link Bridge, thinking of Amara sleeping soundly in the next room, her breath rhythmic and peaceful. She had been his rock through the final years of his struggle, the woman who entered his life just as the clouds began to part. He closed the laptop, the EO burned into his retinas like a solar flare, and wondered why a stranger would invest so heavily in a man who already had everything. The silence of the house felt heavy, no longer the silence of peace, but the silence of a secret waiting for the right moment to scream. Morning in the Atagoke household was a choreographed ballet of high-end espresso machines and the soft rustle of expensive silk. Amara moved through the kitchen with a grace that suggested she had never known a day of lack, her skin glowing with the kind of radiance that only comes from a life shielded from the harsh Lagos sun. She handed Kofi his coffee, her smile hitting him with the same warmth that had captivated him the night they met at a gallery opening 6 years ago. To the world, they were the power couple, the architect and the curator, a duo that represented the pinnacle of Nigerian excellence. Kofi watched her over the rim of his cup, searching for a flicker of something, a tell, a shadow, a hint of the EO that haunted his dreams the night before. He thought about the wedding, the way she had looked in her lace gown, and how, miraculously, the crushing weight of his final tuition arrears had vanished just weeks before they said "I do." He had told her then that he had secured a private grant, a lie born of pride because he couldn't bear for her to see him as a man in debt. She had cheered for him, kissed him, and never asked for the details. And in his relief, he had allowed the lie to become his truth. As he drove his SUV through the snarling traffic of the Third Mainland Bridge, the city's chaos felt distant, muffled by the German engineering of his car. Yet the E.O. remained a sharp, jagged thought in his mind. He began to replay the timeline of his success, realizing with a jolting clarity that every major career leap, his first firm, his first major contract, his professional license, had been preceded by a mysterious clearing of his financial hurdles. He had always credited his talent and his relentless work ethic But now he began to wonder if he was merely an actor on a stage where the rent was being paid by a ghost. The ego is a fragile thing. It prefers a hard-earned victory over a gifted one, and Kofi felt a simmering resentment building against this anonymous benefactor. By the time he reached his office in Ikoyi, the clerical error excuse had withered and died. He picked up his phone and dialed his old contact at the bank, a man named Tund, who owed him a favor from a project years ago. Tund, Kofi said, his voice dropping to a low, commanding frequency. I need a name. Not an initial, not a code. I need to know exactly whose bank account has been feeding mine for the last 5 years. The blue light of the MacBook screen slashed across Kofi's face like a neon scar, the only illumination in a study that smelled of expensive leather and the faint, metallic tang of an impending storm. Outside, the Lagos night was a chaotic symphony of distant generators and the rhythmic crashing of the Atlantic against the Bar Beach shoreline. But inside, there was only the sound of a man's breathing, labored, rhythmic, and heavy with the weight of a dawning realization. Kofi sat surrounded by a fortress of physical folders he had spent the last 4 hours retrieving from the depths of his mahogany filing cabinets, each one representing a year of his ascent from a hungry graduate to a celebrated architect. He began to lay the digital printouts side by side with his old handwritten ledgers from his days in the cramped hostels of Unilag, creating a timeline of his financial life that looked less like a success story and more like a carefully managed experiment. The Yo signature appeared with a haunting regularity, always arriving just as the interest rates threatened to swallow his meager savings, or when a professional certification fee loomed like an impassable wall. It was a surgical intervention, a ghost in the machine that knew exactly when he was about to break, providing just enough buoyancy to keep his head above water while allowing him to believe he was swimming on his own strength. He felt a sickening lurch in his gut, a vertigo born of the realization that his narrative of the self-made man was a house of cards, and the wind was finally starting to blow from a direction he hadn't prepared for. As he delved deeper into the data, the psychological weight of the discovery began to manifest as a physical pressure behind his eyes, a throbbing reminder that every brick he had laid in his career was mortared with someone else's charity. He began to cross-reference the dates of the largest payments with his personal journals, his fingers trembling as he turned the pages of a life he thought he understood. The Yo wasn't just paying for books and tuition. The payments were timed to his most vulnerable moments of ego and ambition, providing the grants and scholarships that had allowed him to take risks other men from his background wouldn't dare. He saw a payment of 2 million naira dated exactly 3 days after he had proposed to Amara, a sum that had mysteriously appeared in his account under the guise of an Alumni Excellence Award, which he had used to secure the down payment on their first apartment. He realized then that his marriage, the very foundation of his happiness, had been subsidized by a phantom whose motives remained shrouded in a terrifying silence. The silence of the room grew oppressive, the shadows in the corners stretching like grasping hands, as Kofi realized that he didn't just owe money, he owed his entire identity to a man who had watched him from the darkness for a decade. He closed his eyes, seeing the initials EO burned into the back of his eyelids, a brand that marked him not as a master of his fate, but as a masterpiece owned by a gallery he had never visited. The memory of his wedding day had always been a golden haze of champagne, white lace, and the intoxicating scent of jasmine that seemed to follow Amara wherever she moved. It was the day Kofi felt he had finally arrived, standing at the altar of a fashionable church in Victoria Island, looking at a woman who represented everything beautiful and unattainable about the world he had fought to join. But as he sat in the cold light of the following morning, staring at the bank statement from that very week, the gold turned to lead. The lump sum that had cleared his final, most aggressive student debt, the one that had kept him awake with night sweats, had been deposited 48 hours before he said, "I do." It wasn't just a payment. It was a clearance, a wiping of the slate so that he could enter his marriage as a man of means rather than a man of debt. He traced the numbers with a cold finger, noting how the amount was exactly what was needed to ensure no debt collectors would ever call the house he was about to share with his bride. The precision was chilling suggesting a level of surveillance that bordered on the divine or the obsessive. Whoever Yo was, he hadn't just been helping Kofi. He had been preparing him, grooming him to be the perfect husband for Amara. The realization shifted from financial curiosity to a visceral, protective instinct as Kofi began to see the Yo payments as a rhythmic heartbeat underlying his domestic bliss. He remembered the ease with which Amara had settled into their life, her lack of anxiety about their finances, even when his firm was just starting out, and how she had always encouraged him to trust the universe to provide. Was the universe actually a man with a bank account and a grudge, or perhaps a man with a bank account and a heart so broken it could only express itself through wire transfers? He thought of the night they moved into their Ikoyi mansion, the way Amara had danced through the empty rooms, her laughter echoing against the marble floors he thought he had earned through sheer brilliance. Now, that marble felt cold, like a tombstone marking the death of his autonomy. Every anniversary, every promotion, every major milestone of their shared life was mirrored by a quiet, substantial deposit from the same source, a shadow curriculum that had educated him in the art of being a successful man while someone else paid the tuition of his reality. He felt a sudden, desperate need to see the face behind the initials, to look into the eyes of the man who had bought his life one semester at a time, and to ask the question that was currently poisoning his soul. What was the price of a man's pride when it was bought and paid for before he even knew it was for sale? The headquarters of a student loan trust was a brutalist concrete monolith in the heart of Lagos Island, a place where dreams went to be quantified and debts went to be managed with the cold efficiency of a meat grinder. Kofi navigated the sweltering corridors, his tailored suit a stark contrast to the frayed collars of the desperate young graduates waiting for extensions, their faces etched with the same fear he had worn like a second skin 10 years ago. He found Tund in a back office that smelled of old paper and lukewarm suya, a man whose skin was the color of parched earth, and whose eyes had seen too many ledgers to be surprised by anything. "I told you on the phone, Kofi, these records are private." Tund sighed, his voice raspy from years of shouting over the Lagos traffic outside his window. Third-party payees have rights to anonymity, especially when the amounts are this high. It's usually some philanthropic foundation or a politician looking to wash some conscience money. But Kofi didn't move, his presence filling the small room with a kinetic, dangerous energy that made the stacks of files on Tund's desk seem to tremble. He placed a heavy envelope on the desk, not a bribe, but a collection of his own architectural awards and a photo of his wife, and leaned in, his voice a low, vibrating hum. "I'm not looking for a politician, Tund. I'm looking for the man who thinks he owns my history. Give me the name, or I'll find a way to make this office as obsolete as the debts he's been paying." Tund stared at the photo of Amara for a long beat, a flicker of recognition or perhaps pity crossing his weary features, before he turned to his computer and began the slow, rhythmic clicking that would unlock the vault of Kofi's past. The air in the room seemed to thin, the oxygen replaced by the tension of a secret about to be exhaled after a decade of holding its breath. "The system shows the account is linked to a private trust," Tund whispered, his eyes fixed on the flickering CRT monitor. "But the primary signatory, the man who authorizes the monthly transfers and the lump sum bonuses. His name isn't a foundation." He paused, the cursor blinking like a heartbeat on the screen, reflecting in his glasses. "The name on the original mandate, dated back to your second year of university, is Elias Okonjo." The name hit Kofi with the force of a physical blow, a sound he hadn't heard in years, but one that had always lived in the periphery of his consciousness, a name Amara had once mentioned with a casual, dismissive wave of her hand when they were first dating. Elias. The boy from her home village, the one who had stayed behind when she came to the city, the insignificant shadow she said had never mattered. Kofi felt the world tilt on its axis, the concrete walls of the office closing in as the name Elias began to rewrite every memory he had of his rise to power. He stood up without a word, the Yo finally taking shape as a man of flesh and blood, a man who had been paying for Kofi's education so that Amara wouldn't have to marry a failure. The drive back from the bank was a blurred montage of yellow Danfo buses and street hawkers, The vibrant chaos of Legos filtered through the tinted glass of Kofi's SUV like a silent movie. Elias Okonjo. The name tasted like copper in his mouth, a metallic, bitter flavor that wouldn't wash away no matter how many times he swallowed. He remembered the way Amara had described him once, during a rainy evening in their early days, calling him a good soul with no ambition, a man who was content to work the family land and live a quiet, unremarkable life. She had laughed when she said it, a light, melodic sound that Kofi had taken as a sign of her devotion to him, the ambitious architect who was going to conquer the world. But now, that laughter sounded like a hollow bell. If Elias had no ambition, how had he managed to funnel millions of naira into Kofi's bank accounts? How does a man with no ambition become the silent architect of another man's destiny? The cognitive dissonance was deafening, a roar of questions that drowned out the radio and the honking horns of the city. He realized that Elias hadn't just been paying his loans. He had been paying for Kofi to become the man Amara deserved, a sacrificial act of love so profound and so twisted that it made Kofi's own success look like a cheap imitation of greatness. By the time he pulled into his driveway in Ikoyi, the sun was beginning to set, casting long, bruised shadows across the manicured lawn. He sat in the car for a long time, watching the lights flicker on inside the house, seeing the silhouette of Amara as she moved past the window, elegant and serene. He felt like an intruder in his own life, a squatter in a palace built on another man's heartbreak. He wondered if she knew, if every time she looked at him, she saw the ghost of Elias standing behind him, holding the checkbook. Or worse, did she not know? Was she as much a victim of Elias's silent devotion as Kofi was? The thought that his entire life was a curated experience, a gift from a man he had never met to a woman who had left him behind, made Kofi want to scream into the steering wheel. He stepped out of the car, the humid evening air clinging to him like a damp shroud, and walked toward the front door with the gait of a man heading toward an execution. He wasn't just going home to his wife. He was going home to a crime scene where the evidence was hidden in plain sight, in the very walls he had designed and the very bed where they slept. The name Elias was no longer just a name. It was a verdict, and Kofi was finally ready to hear the full sentence. Dinner was a masterpiece of tension disguised as domesticity: grilled croaker fish, jollof rice that smelled of smoked paprika, and a bottle of chilled white wine that cost more than most people in Lagos made in a month. Amara was talking about a new exhibition at the Nike Art Gallery, her eyes bright with the passion she always reserved for her work, her hands moving in small, graceful gestures that emphasized her points. Kofi watched her, his own plate untouched, his mind a fever dream of bank statements and signatures. He waited for a lull in the conversation, a moment where the air was still enough for a bomb to drop. "I ran into an old contact at the bank today," he said, his voice sounding thin and foreign to his own ears. "Someone who mentioned a name from your past. Elias Okonjo." The effect was instantaneous, though subtle. Amara's fork paused for a fraction of a second before continuing its journey to her plate, and the light in her eyes didn't dim so much as it hardened into a defensive glaze. She didn't look up. Her focus suddenly intensified on the fish she was deboning with surgical precision. "Elias? That's a name I haven't heard in ages," she said, her tone light, airy, and entirely too practiced. "He was just a boy from the village, Kofi, a childhood friend. Why would anyone at the bank be talking about him?" The lie was beautiful in its simplicity, a smooth, polished stone of a sentence that gave nothing away. But to Kofi, it felt like a slap. He leaned forward, the candlelight reflecting in his eyes, searching for the crack in her armor that he knew had to be there. "Because he's the one who paid off my student loans, Amara. He's the one who's been sending thank you notes for 10 years. The one who made sure we had enough money for this house before I had even earned it." He watched as the color drained from her face, leaving her the color of ash in the flickering light. She didn't deny it. She didn't feign confusion or anger. Instead, she slowly put her fork down and looked at him with a gaze that was suddenly ancient, filled with a sadness that Kofi realized he had never truly seen before. "He promised," she whispered, her voice barely audible over the hum of the refrigerator. He promised my father on his deathbed that he would make sure I was taken care of, that I would never know a day of struggle, even if I chose someone else. The confession hung in the air like smoke, a suffocating revelation that shifted the ground beneath Kofi's feet once again. Elias hadn't just been helping a stranger. He had been fulfilling a covenant, a sacred debt of the heart that Kofi was merely the vehicle for. The casual lie wasn't just about a childhood friend. It was about a love so total that it had deleted itself to ensure her happiness. And Kofi was the unintended beneficiary of a man's ultimate sacrifice. Sleep was impossible, a distant shore that Kofi couldn't reach through the stormy waters of his own mind. At 3 a.m., he found himself in the attic, rummaging through the archive boxes, the remnants of their first year together, the papers and mementos they had shoved away as they moved into their higher tax bracket lives. He was looking for something specific, a physical tether to the man who had ghosted through his bank accounts for a decade. He finally found it at the bottom of a box of old lease agreements, a small, yellowed card that had been tucked into a welcome to your new home bouquet from the night Amara moved in. The card was unsigned, but the handwriting was a distinctive, obsessive script, the letters leaning slightly to the left, the E's looped with a flourish that looked like a coiled spring. He pulled out the printout of the bank mandate Tund had given him and laid them side by side on the dusty floor. The signatures were identical. Elias hadn't just been paying the bills. He had been there, at the very beginning of their shared life, sending flowers to the woman he had lost, paid for by the money he was giving to the man who had won her. It was a level of psychological complexity that made Kofi's head spin, a mixture of agonizing devotion and a subtle, invisible dominance that left Kofi feeling like a puppet on a string made of Naira notes. He stared at the signature until the ink seemed to bleed into the paper, imagining Elias's hand as it wrote those words, imagining the pain of signing a check that would facilitate the happiness of the woman you loved with another man. He realized that the signature wasn't just a legal authorization. It was a diary entry of a slow-motion heartbreak. He thought about the night Amara moved in, how they had made love on the floor of the empty living room, surrounded by the scent of those very flowers, never knowing that the man who paid for the roof over their heads was mourning her in a quiet room somewhere else in the city. The betrayal he felt wasn't directed at Amara, but at the universe itself for allowing such a lopsided reality to exist. He felt a sudden, sharp clarity. He couldn't live in this house anymore, couldn't look at his degree on the wall, without seeing Elias's looping E's etched into the glass. He needed to find the man, not to thank him, but to confront the reality of his own existence. He needed to know if Elias hated him, or if he looked at Kofi's success as his own greatest achievement. The signature was the map, and the trail was no longer cold. It was burning a hole in the floor of his attic, demanding that he follow it to its bitter, inevitable end. Finding a ghost in a city of 20 million people is an exercise in futility unless that ghost wants to be found, or unless he has left a trail of breadcrumbs made of high-value transactions. Kofi hired a private investigator, a man named Chitty who specialized in discreet corporate vetting, which was a polite Lagosian term for digging up dirt that people had spent a lifetime burying. Chitty was a man who moved through the city like a shadow, a silent observer of the cracks in the facades of the wealthy, and he looked at Kofi's request with a mixture of professional curiosity and seasoned skepticism. "You're looking for a man who pays people's debts and asks for nothing in return?" Chitty asked, leaning back in his small, cluttered office in Surelier. "In this city, that's not a man, that's a saint or a madman. And saints are much harder to find than madmen." But the money Kofi offered was enough to turn a cold trail hot, and within 48 hours, Chitty had produced a folder that felt heavier than its physical weight. Elias Okonjo wasn't a tycoon or a criminal mastermind. He was a man who had lived a life of extreme, almost monastic frugality, working as a senior clerk for a shipping firm while living in a modest, rent-controlled apartment in a part of the city that time had forgotten. The dossier revealed a man who had no social media presence, no expensive habits, and no family other than a sister who lived in the UK. Every kobo he earned, beyond the bare essentials for survival, had been diverted into the trust that funded Kofi's life. He was a man who had intentionally stunted his own growth to fertilize the garden of someone else's future. Kofi read the report in the back of his car, the text blurring as he processed the sheer scale of the self-denial involved. Elias hadn't just been taken care of by a family legacy. He had built a legacy out of his own flesh and blood, one bank transfer at a time. The trail led to a quiet street in Ibut Meta, a neighborhood of crumbling colonial houses and narrow alleys where the air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and the sea. It was a world away from the glass towers of Ikoyi, a place where the past was still alive and breathing. Kofi felt a wave of nausea as he realized that while he was designing luxury villas for the elite, the man who had made it all possible was living in a room that likely didn't even have consistent electricity. The trail wasn't just cold. It was a descent into a reality that Kofi had spent his whole life trying to escape, only to find that he had never truly left it. The air in the bedroom was thick enough to choke on, the silence between Kofi and Amara no longer a bridge but a canyon. He didn't wait for her to sit down. He threw the dossier from Chitty onto the bed, the papers spilling out like white bones on the silk duvet. Ibut Meta, Amara. He lives in a shanty in Ibut Meta while we live here. He's been eating dust so I could study architecture and you could curate art. His voice was a jagged blade, cutting through the carefully constructed peace of their evening. Amara stood by the window, her back to him, her shoulders shaking with a silent, rhythmic tremor. She didn't turn around for a long time, and when she did, her face was a mask of such profound grief that Kofi's anger faltered, replaced by a cold, creeping dread. "You think I didn't try to stop him?" she whispered, her voice cracking like dry earth. "You think I wanted this debt hanging over us? Every time I tried to send him money back, he would return it with a note saying it wasn't for me, it was for the man I chose. He said if I loved you, I would let you be the man you were meant to be, without the weight of the world on your back." The confrontation shifted from an accusation of a secret to an exploration of a tragedy. Kofi felt the walls of his reality crumbling, the ceiling he had designed falling in on him. "He wanted me to be the man he couldn't be," Kofi shouted, his hands gesturing wildly at the room around them. "He didn't do this for me, Amara. He did it to keep you. He bought me, so he could stay in your life, so that every time you looked at our success, you were looking at his sacrifice." Amara walked toward him, her eyes pleading, her hands reaching out but stopping short of touching him. "No, Kofi. He did it because he knew I loved you more than I could ever love him. He knew that if you failed, I would stay with you and we would both suffer, and he couldn't bear the thought of me suffering. He paid for your freedom so that I could be happy. Don't you see? He didn't buy you. He set me free to love you without fear." The logic was a twisted, beautiful nightmare, a theory of love that made Kofi feel small and insignificant. He looked at the woman he loved, the woman who was the center of his universe, and realized that their entire romance was a garden tended by a man who was starving outside the gate. The first confrontation hadn't brought clarity. It had only revealed the depth of the shadows that defined their light. "There are debts of the pocket, and there are debts of the soul," Amara said, her voice regaining a hollow kind of strength as she sat on the edge of the bed, the dossier still lying between them like a dead thing. She began to explain the theory of debts that Elias had lived by, the idea that in the grand economy of the universe, some people are born to be creditors and others to be debtors, not out of malice, but out of a cosmic necessity. She told Kofi about the letters Elias had sent her over the years, letters she had burned, but whose contents were etched into her mind. He believed that by paying for Kofi's education, he was ensuring that the best version of the world was allowed to exist. He saw Kofi's talent as a public good, something that shouldn't be stifled by the petty struggle for survival, and he saw his own life as a small price to pay for the preservation of that brilliance. To Elias, the money wasn't a loan. It was an investment in a masterpiece he would never own, a way of participating in a life that was closed to him. Kofi listened, his pride as an architect, a man who builds things to last, withering under the weight of a structure he hadn't designed. He called it invisible love. Amara continued, her eyes fixed on a point in the distance. He said that the purest form of love is the one that requires nothing in return, not even acknowledgement. He wanted you to feel self-made because he knew that your confidence was the engine of your success. If you knew he was paying, you would have felt like a charity case, and you never would have taken the risks that made you famous. Kofi felt a surge of visceral disgust, a rejection of the idea that his entire personality was a product of someone else's psychological engineering. He was a man. He was a project. He realized that the most expensive thing Elias had given him wasn't the tuition or the house. It was the illusion of his own strength. Every time he had looked in the mirror and seen a winner, he was seeing the reflection of Elias's bank balance. The theory of debts was a prison, and the bars were made of the very success he had spent his life chasing. He looked at Amara and saw, for the first time, the flicker of a question in her eyes. Did she love the man Kofi was, or did she love the man Elias had allowed him to become? The morning air in Ibut Meta was thick with the smell of the lagoon and the sound of a city waking up to another day of survival. Kofi left his SUV 3 blocks away, feeling that his presence in such a vehicle was an insult to the reality of the streets he was walking. He moved through the narrow alleys, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird, his eyes scanning the rusted gates and peeling paint for the number Chitty had given him. He felt like a ghost hunter, searching for a spirit that had haunted his life for a decade, a man who was both a stranger and his most intimate partner. When he finally found the house, a 2-story colonial structure that looked like it was being held together by hope and several layers of soot, he stopped, his hand hovering over the iron knocker. He realized that once he crossed this threshold, the self-made Kofi would be dead forever, replaced by a man who knew exactly how much his soul had cost on the open market. He took a deep breath, the salt air stinging his lungs, and knocked. The door was opened by an old woman with eyes like clouded marbles, who looked at Kofi's expensive watch and polished shoes with a weary indifference. "He's upstairs," she said, before he could even speak. "He's been waiting for you. He said you'd come once you stopped being afraid of the truth." The house inside was a labyrinth of shadows and the smell of old books, a stark contrast to the sterile, modern lines of Kofi's own home. As he climbed the creaking wooden stairs, he felt a sense of vertigo, as if he were descending into the basement of his own consciousness. He reached the top landing and saw a door slightly ajar, a sliver of light spilling out onto the floor. He pushed it open and stepped into a room that was small, cramped, and filled from floor to ceiling with sketches, blueprints, and photographs. Kofi gasped, his knees buckling. Every wall was covered with his own work, the buildings he had designed, the awards he had won, the articles written about him. And there, in the center of the room, was a massive, framed photo of his wedding day, with Amara smiling and Kofi looking triumphantly at the camera. He wasn't in a stranger's room. He was in a shrine to his own life, a place where his success was the only thing that gave the walls meaning. The room didn't just contain photographs. It was a physical manifestation of a life Kofi thought he had lived alone, a meticulously curated museum where he was the sole exhibit and Elias was the silent curator. Every wall was a tectonic plate of paper and ink, covered with newspaper clippings of Kofi's first major commission, sketches of the Lekki Bridge he had helped design, and even grainy printouts of his social media posts from years ago. It was an architectural blueprint of his soul, mapped out with the precision of a man who had studied the distance between Kofi's ambitions and his achievements more closely than Kofi himself ever had. In the center of the room sat a scarred wooden desk, and atop it, framed in heavy, ornate silver that looked out of place in the crumbling house, was a photo of Kofi and Amara's wedding. It was the moment they stepped out of the church, the sun hitting Amara's veil like a halo. But in this room, the light felt stolen, filtered through the lens of a man who had watched from the back row, invisible and essential. Kofi felt a wave of nausea wash over him as he realized that the air in this room was thick with a devotion that bordered on the religious, a silent, vibrating frequency of love and loss that made his own success feel like a cheap, hollow echo of Elias's profound suffering. He began to realize that he wasn't looking at a rival's lair, but at the engine room of his own existence, the place where the heat of another man's heartbreak had been converted into the electricity that powered Kofi's bright, shiny world. He moved toward the desk, his hands trembling as he touched the edge of a notebook filled with Elias's looping, left-leaning script, the same script that had haunted his bank statements for a decade. Inside were lists of numbers, brutal and stark. The cost of cement, the price of a professional license exam, the quarterly interest rates on a student loan that had long ago been extinguished. Next to each figure was a date and a note, tiny and precise. He needs this for the internship, or she must never know the struggle of the rent. It was a ledger of a life sacrificed in increments, the slow-motion suicide of the self to ensure the survival of a dream Elias would never share. Kofi saw a small, dried flower pressed between the pages, a sprig of jasmine, the same scent Amara wore on their first date, and the realization hit him like a physical blow to the chest. Elias hadn't just been paying for the education. He had been paying for the atmosphere of peace that allowed their love to bloom, a climate control for their romance that kept the harsh reality of poverty at bay. He looked at the wedding photo again and saw, for the first time, a small, blurry figure in the far background, half hidden by a pillar of the church, a man in a plain suit watching the woman he loved give her life to someone else. Kofi realized with a chilling certainty that his entire life was a performance, and the only person who truly understood the cost of the ticket was the man who had been sitting in the dark, applauding until his hands bled. The sound of a heavy, wet cough erupted from the corner of the room, drawing Kofi's attention to a small cot tucked behind a partition of stacked books. There, lying beneath a threadbare blanket that seemed too small for his frame, was Elias, a man who looked 20 years older than the age Kofi knew him to be. His skin was the color of parched earth, stretched thin over a skeleton that seemed to be vibrating with the effort of simply existing, his eyes sunken but burning with a lucidity that was terrifying in its intensity. He didn't look surprised to see Kofi. He looked relieved, as if a long-awaited sentence had finally been handed down and he could finally stop holding his breath. "You took longer than I expected, Kofi," he rasped, his voice a dry rustle of leaves against a window pane. "I thought a man who designs such efficient buildings would be faster at solving the architecture of his own life." He didn't move to get up, his body clearly failing him, but his presence filled the room with a weight that made Kofi feel small, a child standing in the presence of an ancient, weary god. There was no malice in his gaze, only a profound, exhausted kindness that was harder to bear than any anger could have been. Kofi stood frozen, the dossier of bank statements feeling like a lead weight in his hand, the questions he had prepared dissolving into the stagnant air of the room. "Why?" was all he could manage to whisper, the words sounding inadequate against the backdrop of a decade of silent labor. Elias smiled, a slow, painful movement that revealed teeth yellowed by years of cheap tea and missed meals, and he gestured toward the wall of photos. "Because she looked at you the way she never looked at me," Elias said, his voice gaining a momentary, fragile strength. "She looked at you and saw the future. She looked at me and saw the village, the past, the struggle we were both trying to escape. I realized very early that if I kept her, she would eventually grow to hate the limitations of my life. But if I gave her to you, and I made sure you never failed, she would stay happy. And if she was happy, then my life had a purpose that went beyond just surviving." He spoke of his own erasure as if it were a logical necessity, a business transaction where he had traded his own happiness for a version of the world that contained her smile. Kofi looked at the man's frail hands, the hands that had signed away a fortune to build a life he would never live, and felt a surge of visceral shame that he had ever called himself self-made. He realized that Elias wasn't a ghost haunting his life. He was the foundation, the buried concrete that held up the skyscraper of Kofi's ego, invisible and carrying all the weight. Elias began to tell the story of the covenant, a promise made in a hospital room in a remote village years ago when Amara's father lay dying of a fever that no one could afford to treat. He described the smell of the damp earth and the sound of the rain on the corrugated iron roof as the old man took Elias's hand and begged him to save his daughter from the cycle of lack that had defined their ancestors. "He didn't ask me to marry her," Elias whispered, his eyes clouded with the memory. "He asked me to protect her. He knew I loved her with a desperation that was dangerous. But he also knew that love isn't enough to feed a woman's soul in a city like Lagos. I promised him that she would never know the cold of an empty pocket or the shame of a rejected dream." He explained how he had followed them to the city, working 3 jobs, sleeping in shifts, and funneling every kobo into the trust he had established under a pseudonym. He had watched from the shadows as Kofi entered the picture, and instead of fighting for her, he had decided to invest in her choice. He had seen Kofi's brilliance and realized that with the right backing, Kofi could become the man who would give Amara the world, a world Elias could only ever describe but never provide. The logic was as beautiful as it was horrifying, a sacrifice so total that it had bypassed the ego entirely. Elias had spent his prime years as a senior clerk, living on Gary and water, enduring the ridicule of his colleagues who wondered why a man with no family and no vices was so stingy with his money. They didn't know he was buying marble for a kitchen in Ikoyi or paying for the private security that kept Amara safe in her gated community. "I became the wind beneath your wings, Kofi, because I knew you were the only bird she wanted to fly with," Elias said, a faint glimmer of pride appearing in his eyes. "I didn't do it for you. I did it because I couldn't live in a world where she was unhappy. If that meant I had to be the one to pay for your wedding ring, then that was the price of my soul, and I paid it gladly." Kofi felt the room spinning, the moral weight of the revelation crushing his sense of reality. He realized that his marriage was a sacred trust, a contract signed in Elias's blood and honored in his own ignorance. He looked at the man who had been his silent partner for a decade and saw not a rival, but a martyr of the highest order, a man who had loved a woman so much he was willing to become the man she didn't choose, just to ensure she never regretted her choice. Kofi returned to his office the next day, but the sleek, modern space felt like a prison, the awards on the walls looking like stolen goods. He stared at the blueprints for a new luxury development in Eco-Atlantic, and for the first time in his career, the lines didn't make sense. They felt like scars on the landscape, vanity projects built on the suffering of people like Elias. He realized that his entire professional identity was predicated on a lie of independence, a delusion that he had carved his path through sheer merit. Every time he had been lucky enough to secure a loan or blessed with a sudden influx of capital, it hadn't been the hand of God or the favor of the market. It had been a man in a crumbling house in Ibiut Meta, skipping meals to pay for Kofi's drafting software. The crisis wasn't just financial, it was existential. He felt a sudden, violent urge to tear down everything he had built, to admit to the world that he was a fraud, a man who had been carried across the finish line on the back of a better man. He looked at his hands and saw not the hands of a master builder, but the hands of a beneficiary, a child who had been given the keys to a kingdom he didn't know was bought on credit. The silence of the office was interrupted by his secretary, who brought in a bottle of expensive champagne from a client, a gift for a self-made titan of industry. Kofi looked at the bottle and felt a surge of bile in his throat. He thought of Elias's stained tea mugs and the threadbare blanket in that small, cramped room. He realized that the gap between his life and Elias's wasn't just a matter of wealth, but a matter of character. Elias was the true architect, the one who had designed a life of such intricate, selfless beauty that it had survived 10 years without a single pillar of recognition. Kofi was merely the occupant of the structure Elias had built. He called Amara, his voice thick with a mixture of grief and resolve. "We're going back," he said, not waiting for her to answer. "We're going back to Ibiut Meta. We can't live like this anymore, Amara. We are living inside a man's ribcage, and it's time we stop pretending the air is ours." He hung up before she could respond, already beginning to pack his things, the symbols of his status suddenly feeling like the chains of a very comfortable, very expensive debt. He knew that the only way to reclaim his soul was to acknowledge the man who had been holding it in escrow for a decade, and to finally pay the one debt that money could never settle. Amara was waiting for him at the front door of their Ikoyi home, her face a mask of quiet, resolute sorrow. She didn't argue when he told her they were going to see Elias. She simply nodded and stepped into the car, her movements slow and deliberate, as if she were walking through water. As they drove through the darkening streets of Lagos, she finally spoke, her voice a low vibration that seemed to come from deep within her chest. "I didn't choose you because of the money, Kofi. I chose you because you were the only one who saw me as a person, not as a prize to be won or a promise to be kept." She explained the two-heart problem, the impossible choice between a man who loved her with a terrifying, sacrificial devotion that made her feel like a debt to be repaid, and a man who loved her with the easy, arrogant confidence of the future. She had loved Elias, but his love was a heavy thing, a weight that threatened to pull her back into the soil of their village, whereas Kofi's love felt like flight. She had married Kofi to escape the burden of being Elias's everything, only to realize that Elias had followed her into her new life, turning her escape into a subsidized reality. "I didn't know about the loans until after we were married," she whispered, her hand resting on the leather dashboard of the SUV. "And when I found out, I realized that telling you would destroy you. You were so proud of your struggle, so certain that you had beaten the system. If I had told you that Elias was the one holding the ladder, you would have hated him, and you would have hated me, and eventually you would have hated yourself. I kept the secret to protect your ego, Kofi, but in doing so, I became Elias's silent partner in your deception." The revelation hit Kofi with the force of a second betrayal. He realized that his marriage was a three-way pact of silence, a conspiracy of love that had kept him in a state of perpetual, gilded infancy. They were both victims and perpetrators of a love that was too big for any one of them to carry. As they pulled up to the house in Ibut Meta, the contrast between their luxury vehicle and the decaying neighborhood was a physical ache. They were two people who had been living in the penthouse of a building whose foundation was currently crumbling in the basement, and as they stepped out into the humid night, they both knew that the time for secrets had finally, mercifully, come to an end. The air in Elias's room had changed. It no longer smelled of old paper and dust, but the unmistakable, metallic tang of the end. He was weaker than he had been even 2 days prior, his breathing shallow and punctuated by long, terrifying silences that made the room feel as if it were holding its breath. Amara went to his side instantly, her silk dress brushing against the grime of the floor as she took his hand, her tears falling onto his parched skin like a baptism. Elias didn't speak. He simply looked at her with a gaze that was so full of light it seemed to illuminate the entire room, a look of such profound, achieved peace that it silenced the questions in Kofi's mind. He was a man who had finished his work, a builder who had seen his masterpiece completed and was finally ready to lay down his tools. He looked from Amara to Kofi, a faint, flickering nod of acknowledgement passing between the two men, the one who had paid and the one who had played the part. There was no need for words. The ledger was balanced, the debt was acknowledged, and the ghost was finally being seen in the light of day. For 3 days, Kofi and Amara stayed in that small room, a vigil that felt like a penance and a privilege all at once. Kofi used his wealth to bring in the best doctors, to buy the best equipment, but he knew it was a futile gesture, a desperate attempt to pay back a decade of sacrifice in a weekend of luxury. Elias refused the private hospital, choosing instead to stay in a room filled with his photos and his sketches, the shrine to a life he had curated from afar. He died on the 3rd night, just as the Harmattan wind began to howl through the narrow alleys of Ibut Meta, his hand in Amara's and his eyes fixed on the wedding photo on the desk. He didn't leave a will, for he had nothing left to give. He had already spent his life, his health, and his future on a man he barely knew and a woman he could never have. As the doctors pronounced him gone, Kofi felt a sudden, sharp release of tension, as if a wire that had been pulled taut for 10 years had finally snapped. He looked at the man who had been his benefactor, his rival, and his greatest teacher, and realized that he had never even known the sound of Elias's laughter. He had only known the sound of his checks clearing and the silence of a love that was too pure to ever ask for a name. The funeral was a small, quiet affair in a cemetery on the edge of the city, a place where the grass grew tall and the headstones were often swallowed by the hungry Lagos soil. There were no dignitaries, no press, and no architects' associations to pay their respects, for to the world, Elias Okonjo was just another clerk who had died without a family or a fortune. Kofi and Amara stood under a black umbrella as the rain turned the earth to a thick, red mud, their expensive clothes a stark contrast to the simple wooden casket. Kofi had paid for the burial, but he felt like an intruder, a man paying for the funeral of the person who had paid for his life. He watched as the dirt was shoveled onto the wood. The sound a dull, rhythmic thud that felt like the closing of a book he had only just begun to read. He realized that the world would never know the name of the man who had built the skylines of Lagos by proxy, the man who had lived in a shanty so that another man could live in a palace. Amara didn't cry at the graveside. She stood with a terrifying, stoic grace, her eyes fixed on the horizon as if she were searching for a ghost that had finally found its rest. When the service was over, they walked back to the car in silence. The weight of the loss settled into their bones like a permanent chill. Kofi looked back at the fresh mound of earth and realized that his success was no longer a source of pride, but a source of responsibility. He couldn't go back to being the self-made architect. He had to become the man Elias had paid for him to be, a man of substance, of integrity, and of a love that was willing to move in the shadows. He took Amara's hand, and for the first time in months, there was no secret between them, only the shared burden of a legacy they hadn't earned but were now required to honor. The rain washed the dust of the city from the car as they drove away, leaving Elias alone in the red earth, the silent partner who had finally signed his last check and closed the ledger of a life well spent on someone else's happiness. 1 week after the funeral, a thick, cream-colored envelope arrived at Kofi's office, postmarked from a legal firm in the UK that Kofi had never heard of. Inside was the final statement from a student loan trust, a document that usually arrived as a digital PDF but was now a physical, stamped piece of history. The balance was zero, the account closed, and the final interest payment had been settled in full. But it was the note attached to the bottom of the page that made Kofi's breath hitch in his throat, a small slip of yellow paper with that familiar, looping script. It wasn't a bank notification. It was a letter dated the night before Elias had died, written with a hand that must have been shaking with the effort of every stroke. Kofi, it began, the name looking strange in Elias's handwriting. I have finished the work. You are free now. Do not spend your life looking back at the man in the shadow. Look forward at the woman who chose you. Build things that last, not for the fame, but for the people who will never know your name. That is the only way to truly pay a debt. Love is the only currency that matters in the end, and I have spent all of mine on you. Be the man she deserves. Forever yours, Io. Kofi sat in his high-backed leather chair, the letter in his hand, and looked out at the city he had helped build. He saw the towers of Victoria Island, the bridges of Lekki, and the shimmering water of the lagoon, and he realized that they weren't just monuments to progress. They were monuments to the invisible people who make progress possible. He stood up, walked to his wall of awards, and began to take them down one by one until the wall was bare and clean. He replaced them with a single, small photograph, the one of Elias's desk in Ibut Meta, with the wedding photo and the sprig of jasmine. He knew that his life would never be the same, that the arrogance of his youth was gone, replaced by a quiet, steady resolve to live a life worthy of the sacrifice that had funded it. He walked out of his office, leaving the final statement on the desk, and went home to the woman he loved, a man who was finally, for the first time in his life, debt-free. As he entered his house, he saw Amara in the garden, planting a jasmine bush in the center of the lawn, the scent already beginning to fill the evening air. He realized that they were no longer living in a house of mirrors or a shrine to the past. They were living in a home built on the only foundation that matters, the truth of a love that pays the debts it cannot claim. I realized then that my entire success was built on another man's heartbreak. He paid for my future just so the woman he loved could have a life without struggle. If you believe the deepest love is the one that stays silent, share this. Follow for the next chapter of The Ghost in the Ledger.